Joe Watkins Burkett was born on July 8, 1920, in a farmhouse on the outskirts of Trent, Texas. He was the fifth child of John and Arizona Burkett. His middle name commemorated the attending physician, a Dr. Watkins, but the good doctor apparently neglected to fill out any birth certificate to mark the occasion. In early 1921, John and Zona moved from Trent to West Texas. There they rented the Smith Farm in Dawson County, west of O'Donnell. The first known photo of Joe was taken on the Smith place in 1923 or 24. Joe was sitting on a homemade sled made by his big brother Jake, who used to pull him around on it. This photo was also made on the Smith place around 1924. Joe was close to his older sister Wilda.
Well, she was 3 years older than me, and so I guess Mother just turned me over to her, and wherever she went, I followed. We were real close that way when I was little. I followed Wilda everywhere and did just what she did, and I do have a memory that starts long about, I guess, in 1924 at Easter. Why, we're having, Easter Sunday. Why, we went out to hunt Easter eggs, and Wilda, she walked around a bush that was out in the pasture and found the remains of a dead cat, and she just went to ballistic. She took off screaming to the house, and I didn't see the cat. I didn't know what it was. But I went right behind her and matched her scream for scream, and I went by house screaming.
In 1925, Joe's parents bought the Miles place in Dawson County and moved again. The following year, just a few miles down the road in neighboring Lynn County, in a farmhouse near Draw, Texas, Lillian Lorene Dabney was born on June 28, 1926. This photo was made on the porch of the Draw farmhouse when she was 3 months old. Her parents, Gladys and Sam Dabney, called her by her middle name, Lorene. Later, when her younger brother Wesley was a child, his attempt to say Lorene came out as Reno, so the family adopted that nickname for her. Here she is with her father in 1926. And here in 1927 in front of the Draw farmhouse. Here again with her father, Sam. It was in 1927 that Joe started school. O'Donnell, to the west of the Miles place, had the closest school, so that's where Joe went. Because he could already read, though not write, his parents started him in the 2nd grade. That same year, Joe's 2 older brothers started playing music. Elmo, the oldest, played fiddle, and Jake played guitar.
In 1927, I would have been 7 years old, and Elmo and Jake sent off to Sierra and Roebuck somewhere and ordered a fiddle and a guitar. And they started playing music. And I liked that so well, I wanted a fiddle. So I just wanted a fiddle. So Mama said, well, I'll get you one for Christmas. And so Christmas, she got me a fiddle. And it was a toy fiddle from Japan. It was about 11 or 12 inches long, but it would play, it would just make noise. And Elmo saw that that wasn't exactly what I had in mind, and so he looked around, and we had some neighbors that had an old mandolin that was what they call the gourd back one. I mean, it's an Italian Neapolitan. It's the actual name, but it's round back, looked like a Big Dipper. And he borrowed that from him, and that's what I learned on him. I played with a borrowed instrument then for nearly 10 years. I bought my first mandolin in 1936 in the fall. That's the first instrument I bought.
But the same year he bought his mandolin, his brother Jake married and moved away. Elmo and Joe recruited another guitar player, A.C. Hamilton, to form a group called the Roving Vagabonds. In the fall of that year, 1936, they played a number on a radio station in Lubbock, Texas. Lorene continued to grow up in the Draw farmhouse. Here's one of the best pictures of her when she was 2 in 1928. And here, sometime before 1932. In later years, that old farmhouse would play a prominent part in many of Lorene's dreams.
I was scared to go back. We had a north bedroom, and our bed was just right up in the north corner. And we'd be in the central living room there, and the bedroom was just right off from it, and she'd be talking, "Oh, hear how that wind is blowing tonight. Sounds like an old bear." And then she'd send me in there to go to bed, and I was just petrified. And that wind would just howl around that corner. It would just sound like it was something in my dire pain, you know, just shrieking. I mean, that's the way it would sound.
Lorene's sister Wilma was born in 1930. Here the two of them sit on the back step around 1932. Times were hard in 1932. Joe's oldest sister, Cortez, had moved back in with the Burkett family along with her kids, while her husband, Ewell, looked for work, which was scarce. The Miles place became too small for the Burketts. In January of 1932, Joe's family once again moved back to rent the larger Smith place. Joe had to switch schools to the OK School in Dawson County. The same year that Joe moved, Wesley Dabney was born in September of 1932, completing the Dabney family. This photo was likely taken by Gladys of the rest of the family dressed up for a special occasion.
We called my little brother Sonny Boy. His name was Wesley Lee, but no one called him Wesley Lee. He was Sonny Boy to us till he got grown, I guess. I had to take care of him a lot, and I can remember packing him around on my hips. Maybe that's why my hips hurt today. And Mama would be out in the field with my daddy, and so I was in charge of Wilma and Wes, and I think they both learned to hate me pretty good, but I was pretty bossy, I guess.
Here, sometime after 1935, the family is at work on the farm, stacking hay into shocks in the field, and then later gathering them into a horse-drawn wagon to pile into a haystack in the barn. Joe attended the OK School through the 10th grade, the highest grade offered there. He graduated from the school in 1936, valedictorian of his class. The other person in the class was salutatorian. The O'Donnell School offered the 11th grade, so Joe enrolled there once again in the fall of 1936. This photo was made about that time at the O'Donnell Laundry, which offered 3 photos for $1. But before Joe completed the first semester, his family moved again in January of 1937 to a farm near the Mesquite community in Borden County, east of O'Donnell. Here's Joe in 1937 at the age of 16 or 17. Joe's older brother Jake had returned with his family to the area and was living temporarily at the Miles place. Joe stayed with Jake until the end of the first semester at O'Donnell, then dropped out of school to join the rest of his family at the Mesquite farmhouse. He would go back to school in O'Donnell in January of 1938 to finish the 11th grade, the highest offered at that time. This photo is from the 1938 yearbook, La Aguila, the Eagle. Here's another shot from that yearbook of Joe and the debate club. That year he won first place in the county in extemporaneous speaking. Lorene attended school at the Draw Red Wine School, 2 miles north of the farm. Here she is at the age of 10 in 1936 in the 5th grade. And here 11 in the 6th grade.
We still were using horses. A lot of people had tractors, but my dad was the last one in the whole community, I think, to get a tractor. And we had horses, and they were work horses, strictly work horses. So we had Old Baldy and Old Blue. I do remember my dad coming in from work. We came in and we always had to unhitch the horses and let them go. And the horses would just be so glad to be out of that harness. And they would just run and roll in the pasture. You know, we had a small pasture out by the side. And they'd turn over and they'd just go into fits, looked like, you know. But I guess I was 12 or 13, or maybe just 11. I would pester my dad from time to time about riding them, and he'd just tell me they weren't riding horses, you know. Well, one night, I don't know, I was just more persistent, and I just kept after him to let me ride Old Baldy. So he just set me up on Old Baldy and didn't have a saddle or anything, and Old Baldy had just been working in the field all day, and he wasn't wanting anyone on his back. So he just took off across the pasture in a dead run, and of course, I fell off on I'm lucky I wasn't hurt any worse, but that cured me from wanting to ride the horses, so, you know.
At 12, in the 7th grade, she graduated that year from grammar school as valedictorian of her class. Here at 13 in the 8th grade, and another picture from the 8th grade around 1939. Age 14, in the 9th grade. Around this time, Lorene's father, Sam, took sick and was confined to his bed with what would later be diagnosed as cancer. Sam had only recently quit plowing with horses and had bought a small tractor. Now his wife Gladys would have to use the new tractor to plow. Lorene also drove the tractor on occasion. The whole family had to work that much harder to keep the farm running and care for Sam as well. Here's Lorene with the 8th and 9th graders of the Draw Red Wine School in 1940 or 41. On her right stands Delbert White, after whom she would later name her first son. Soon after graduating from high school in 1938, Joe bought his first camera and began a lifelong hobby of photography. This photo of his youngest brother, Jim Mack, is one of the first pictures that he took. Joe also continued his other hobby, playing music. In 1938, he switched from mandolin to tenor banjo and sold his mandolin to his sister Wilda, who also played the instrument. The Roving Vagabonds had joined up with two other musicians, Alva Pee Wee Bowles and Dave McMillan, and merged their groups to become Pee Wee and the Jungle Boys. For 4 months in 1937, the group played on Saturday afternoons on the same radio station in Lubbock where the Vagabonds debuted. This picture is actually from 1941. A.C. Hamilton on guitar, Joe, now playing banjo, his younger brother Dale, who joined the group whenever there was a piano available, Dave McMillan, Elmo Burkett, and Pee Wee Bowles. Joe continued to live with his folks on the Mesquite farm. This photo shows him in his parents' bedroom around 1939. Joe continued to help work the farm, and his father set aside the proceeds from about 5 acres for him. On one occasion, after several grueling 14-hour days of driving the tractor, Joe took this photo of himself. But life on the farm was not all work. There were parties, church services, plays, and always music. The girls here are Joe's sister, Katie Louise Burkett, often called Katie Lou, and friend Marie Adams. This photo is from about 1941. The Burkett family attended the Church of Christ services, which were held at the Mesquite schoolhouse. Here's Joe with his brothers Jim Mack and Dale in front of that schoolhouse somewhere between 1938 and 1940. Also around this time, Joe appeared in plays organized by the principal of the Mesquite school. Here he is in the role of a henpecked husband with Ethel Bearden around 1939. Joe started dating in this period. For several months he went with Lita Mae Hale, but she broke a date with him to get married to another fellow. He later dated Ornetha Inman for several months. This photo was probably taken in 1940. Ornetha Inman took this picture of Joe with his Benjamin air rifle, a BB gun. Joe used it mainly to shoot tin cans thrown into the air. Here's a group of young people from the Mesquite community, made up mainly of Burketts, Beardens, and McKees, on a picnic near Gale, Texas, around 1941. Joe is on the far left. His brother Dale is further to the right, and sister Katie Lou at the end. And also from 1941, a picture of Joe on his way to what was called a tacky party. This would have been several months before the attack on Pearl Harbor drew America into World War II. The year 1941 seemed to be a good year for parties. Lorene Dabney, 15 years old and in the 10th grade, went to a party at the home of one of her neighbors. And there, for the first time, she and Joe met. Later that year, Joe went to see the blockbuster movie Gone with the Wind. And as he was leaving the theater, he saw Lorene sitting in the audience for the next showing. He smiled and tipped his hat. December 7, 1941 came, and with it the terrible Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The United States began mobilization for war. Not long after that event, Lorene received a Christmas card from Joe as the opening move of their courtship. Joe continued his hobby of photography and subscribed to a magazine called The Complete Photographer. He developed his own photos and always had an interest in different techniques. From the magazine, Vera Bearden learned the process of hand coloring photos and tried it out on one of Joe's pictures in 1942. Joe was interested in movie cameras as well and bought one secondhand in 1942. The first movies he took with it were in May of that year. The occasion? Joe and Lorene's first date on a group picnic at Post. Not long after their first date, Lorene was in a play at the Draw Red Wine School. Here she is at age 15. Joe took the photo. This is apparently the first still photo of Joe and Lorene together. They're with a group from Draw and Mesquite in front of the Burkett's farmhouse at Mesquite in 1942. The relationship grew serious very quickly. On Lorene's birthday, June 28th, Joe bought her a locket inscribed with her initials and a place for photos inside. When Joe brought Lorene home from being out together, they would park out near an old windmill where they couldn't be seen from the house. Lorene remembers Joe sang to her a tune called Moonlight and Shadows, which became their song. In July of 1942, Joe received notice that he had been drafted into the United States Army. He was sworn in at Lubbock on July 21st and sent back home for the rest of the month. Joe was scheduled to leave for Fort Sills, Oklahoma on Monday, August 3rd. On Sunday, August 2nd, the Burkett clan gathered to see him off after attending Church of Christ services in the morning at the Mesquite schoolhouse. Joe brought Lorene. Here's the John R. Burkett clan on August 3rd, 1942, the day before Joe left. Joe, his father John and mother Arizona. Ewell Kirby with his wife Cortez, Joe's oldest sister. Cuvie Taylor with his wife, Joe's sister Wilda. Dale Burkett. Juanita with her husband Elmo, Joe's oldest brother. Katie Lou and Vernon Hurd, a cousin. Jake Burkett and wife Eileen. J.B. and Lucille Poindexter. Gene Kirby. Lawrence Wayne Taylor, son of Wilda and Cuvie. Joy Kirby, one of Cortez and Ewell's twins. Jim Mac Burkett, holding one of Jake's daughters, Peggy. Evalou, another of the Taylor children. Jake's daughter, Betty. And John Roy Kirby, the other twin of Cortez and Ewell. Lorene was at the gathering as well, but not yet part of the Burkett clan. Joe had given her an engagement ring less than a week earlier, on Monday, July 27th. Neither could remember that Joe ever proposed, but they had an understanding that she would wait for him. Joe had to leave his banjo behind. He would be without an instrument for 3 months of basic training. Joe left for Fort Sills, Oklahoma on August 3, 1942, where he received his gear and took aptitude and IQ tests. After a week there, he boarded a troop train to head across country to Camp Callan in California for basic training.
Now that's at Camp Callan. That's the campground that I trained in. We marched up and down that hill all day long. Stopping hardly, marched down, across, and back up. I believe we made about 11 miles, marched out there 11 miles one evening and pitched our tents, and then there they are. Then the next morning we marched back in.
At the end of basic training, the Army offered to send Joe to officers' training school, but he declined. He stayed on at Camp Callan for about 3 months as part of Battery D of the 51st Anti-Aircraft Training Battalion. Shortly after Joe left for Camp Callan, Lorene went to Lubbock with Joe's sister Katie and had pictures taken at a studio there to send to Joe. She has on the dress that she wore to the party where she and Joe first met. She also wears the locket he had given her for her birthday and a pin he had given her which read, "Sweetheart in the Service." In September, Lorene began her last year of high school, the 11th grade, the highest offered at the time. She was 16 years old. On September 30th, 1942, her father, Samuel Dabney, died of cancer at the age of 57. He had been confined to bed for 2 years. Lorene sent a telegram the same day to notify Joe at Camp Callan. In early November of 1942, Joe was assigned to detached service to study Morse code at the national schools in Los Angeles. Since he learned to type transcribing code, in later years he could not type without transposing the letters into dots and dashes. For the first part of his time in Los Angeles, Joe stayed at the Casa de Rosas. On Thanksgiving, A family named the Hudsons invited Joe and a fellow soldier to dinner. Joe bought a Melody King banjo and resumed his musical hobby. Here he's seen with Bill Ruddy in the yard of the Casa de Rosas. While Joe was in Los Angeles, Lorene and her family had these pictures taken in November of 1942. Wilma, Wes, Gladys, and Lorene. Joe was promoted to corporal on December 23, 1942. He and Lorene wrote to each other nearly every day. 1943 started off with a lot of promise. Joe had received a free ticket to the Rose Bowl, and on the first day of January went to see the game.
One of the big games of the year, and I had a good seat there to see it, and I didn't even know what was going on. I thought since there's people all over the country would give their eye teeth for that seat that I was in, and it didn't mean anything to me.
For Lorene, January was an exciting start to the year. She joined Joe's father and mother and oldest sister Cortez on a train trip all the way out to L.A. to visit Joe from January 15th to the 21st. Lorene must have been excited because the Burkett family reported that on the train trip she walked in her sleep, something she had never done before. Cortez had come along because she also wanted to visit some relatives of her husband who lived in the area. Joe seemed to enjoy this visit from home much more than he had enjoyed the Rose Bowl. Shoes were one of the many items rationed during wartime, but in L.A., Lorene found a pair she could afford. The only trouble was they were made from some cheap material that, when wet, became very slippery. After it rained, Lorene could barely walk in the wet streets. She slid and slipped so much in the shoes that passers-by looked at her as if they thought she was intoxicated. She and the Burketts got a good laugh out of that. Lorene also felt adventuresome enough to order oysters for the first time in her life at a restaurant. She had heard oysters on the half-shell mentioned as a delicious delicacy and was curious to try them. But the raw oysters they brought out for her were not a big hit with Lorene. She left most of them uneaten. Joe received his diploma as a radio operator at national schools on January 29, 1943. He had done well in his training, with excellent code tests. He achieved a rate of 25 words per minute with Morse code and graduated at the top of his class. He was presented with this ring to mark his accomplishment. A couple of days after his graduation, Joe left Los Angeles and traveled by train all the way across the country to his new base at Camp Davis, North Carolina. He was assigned to C Battery of Anti-Aircraft Artillery School. There he trained as a communication chief, studying electricity, electronics, telephone, signaling, message handling, and the like. Joe played music with several fellow soldiers, including Gene Meggs. And Corporal Kelly. Joe completed his next level of training and moved into the instructor's barracks on April 27th. There he found that one of the other soldiers had a recorder to make small vinyl records. Joe was promoted to staff sergeant on May 1st, 1943. That same day, a Saturday, he went into town and bought some blank records. A few days later, he used them with his friend's machine to make a recording of Moonlight and Shadows, his and Lorene's song from their dating days. With his promotion, Joe moved to A Battery. He would stay on at Camp Davis as an instructor, teaching code and message handling for another year until May 1944.
When I was teaching Morse code, and I get a new group of students in, and we'd run, and then I'd give them a test. I could tell in a minute if there was a musician in the bunch, because they just had a natural. So you can see that code is rhythm, dots and dashes. It's rhythm, and I could locate a musician just as soon as I looked at their test papers.
Not long after Joe's promotion, Lorene graduated from high school on May 11th, 1943. She should have been valedictorian, but because of an error in calculation, that honor went to her classmate, Wanda Jean Beard, while Lorene was honored as salutatorian. The error was discovered so much later that Lorene let it stand. A little over a month after she graduated, on July 16th, Lorene left home to attend Drawn's Business School in Lubbock, along with Joe's sister, Katie. Lorene and Katie stayed in the same boarding house. Lorene worked part-time at Rowell's Dining Room, which advertised a price of 35 cents per meal. Later, she worked at Luby's Cafeteria. At the business school, students were given books and expected to learn on their own without an instructor. Lorene hated it, and soon dropped out, returning home to the farm at Draw. Joe got a furlough from September 25th to October 10th and left Camp Davis to come home for a visit. On Sunday, October 3rd, the Burkett clan gathered at the Mesquite farmhouse. Here's Joe's immediate family: Dale, Katie Louise, Jake, Wilda, Elmo, Cortez, and Joe. John R. Burkett, Jim Mack, and Arizona. When the extended family gathered to pose for a picture, Lorene was included for the first time.
During all the time, the 3.5 years I was in the Army, and I think he put it away when I came home.
After his furlough, Joe returned to his work in Camp Davis. Here he is in his winter uniform with his staff sergeant's stripes in late 1943 or early 1944. Joe had this picture taken on December 5th of 1943 to use as a Christmas card. It shows Joe at a radio transmitter used for instruction. Joe made this picture of snow at Camp Davis on December 15th. During the year of 1944, Lorene kept a diary. The first entry, dated January 1st, shows that this new year did not start off well for Lorene, who was back on the farm with her mother at Draw. She wrote, "Dear Diary, what a dreary day. Sat down in the mud and cried because I had to do up the work in the rain. Rained all day without ceasing. Should have been a duck, but unfortunately wasn't. Burned up old letters half of the day. Only hope it doesn't rain all year. I'm not making any New Year's resolutions. Have plenty of unused ones left from last year." The letters she burned were probably ones from Joe, which she did not want her mother to read, and she knew her mother would have read them. Here is her mother, Gladys, on the tractor with Lorene at the farm, probably in late 1943 or early 1944. In her diary, Lorene speaks of working in the house and on the farm, caring for cows and chickens, visiting with neighbors and relatives, going to church and to the movies, enduring snow, sandstorms, and sickness, laughing with her family. At Camp Davis, Joe struck up a friendship with Charlie Hageman. Before the war, Hageman had played professionally as a staff guitarist at WNOX radio station in Knoxville, Tennessee.
The guy playing the guitar, Charlie Hageman, he originally, he started out with Homer and Jethro. He was from Knoxville, Tennessee. He started out with Homer and Jethro when they were just kids. And he was a fine guitar player. He's the one that told me that my playing didn't belong on a banjo, that I ought to switch over to a tenor guitar. So I did.
Joe got a new guitar on April 1st, 1944. Because of the war, Hageman lost his job at the radio station. It was taken by another guitarist, one by the name of Chet Atkins. On April 18th, Joe found out that he was being transferred to active service. On April 23rd, he left Camp Davis and headed by train for Camp Hewlin at Palacios, Texas.
When I left Camp Davis and I was transferred down to Palacios, Texas, and I had what they call a delay en route. They gave me, seemed like 10 days, or maybe it's 13 days to get from North Carolina to my other job, and I made it in time. I had a few days at home.
In her diary for April 27th, Lorene wrote, "Surprise! Joe came in last night and came up this morning. Was I glad to see that guy?" This photo was made a couple of days later. The horse belonged to Jim Mack Burkett. On Sunday, April 30th, Joe and Lorene went to Mesquite, where the Burkett clan gathered. Since Joe was from Texas, his Army buddies expected him to be a cowboy. He didn't want to disappoint them. Here's Lorene in front of her mother's 1939 Mercury, probably in April of 1944 during Joe's visit home. Joe's delay en route ended on May 3rd, 1944. Lorene went with Joe's parents and Jim Mack to the train station at Snyder to see him off. Joe arrived at Camp Hewlin in Palacios the next day, where he was assigned to the 527th Anti-Aircraft Battalion. But before the end of the month, he decided it was time to get married. On May 31st, Lorene wrote cryptically in her diary, "Got that letter from Joe today." Lorene obtained the marriage licenses in Tahoka and headed for Palacios with Joe's mother on June 13th. They arrived in Palacios around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Lorene recorded in her diary, "Joe was there waiting. Mr. and Mrs. Hunter carried us to Bay City."
We're on our way to go get married in this car right now. We went to Bay City, and this fellow, we roomed at their house, took a room at their house, and he's driving us over there. They didn't have a preacher there at Palacios.
The Hunters would become their landlords as Joe and Lorene rented a single room in their house in Palacios. Charles Metcalf was the minister of the Church of Christ who married them on June 14th, 1944 in Bay City, Texas. Lorene wrote, "I didn't know I could be so happy. I'll never forget this day."
Moonlight and shadow and you in my arms, and the melody in the bamboo in my dreams. Divine shadow that you alone, as you hold me tight in the jungle night, but close to my heart, you always will be. Never, never, never to part from me. Moonlight and shadow, and you in my arms. I belong to you belong to me, my sweet. go along. As you hold me down in the jungle like my
Joe's mother stayed for 2 days after the wedding. On the 15th, all three spent the day in Houston. On the 16th, they went crabbing in the Gulf of Mexico at Palacios. Joe and Lorene also had their wedding photo made at a studio that day. Later, they had it hand-painted. But the painter gave the wrong color to Lorene's dress. It was actually gold-colored. They stayed in the Hunter's house in Palacios from June 14th until October 31st. Joe went to Camp Hewlin during the day, usually returning in the afternoon or evening. Lorene wrote in her diary on July 2nd, "I've never been so happy in all my life."